He had only been on the job for a week, but what he uncovered nearly collapsed the entire company from the inside. The sky over Houston that morning was pale. Dew still clung to the glass windows as Jake Brennan stared up at the 12-story glass building with calm eyes. Beneath that calm gaze and steady stride, there was something unreadable, like many old veterans. He carried something invisible, years of experience and the habit of reading situations in silence. Jake had been hired at the headquarters of Evergrove Finance as an internal audit staff member, a position that sounded insignificant, even to himself. But after 3 years of unemployment since retiring from the military, this was his first job. The pay was modest. His office was small, tucked away at the far end, a corridor barely used by anyone. His supervisor, Lenny, a slick 30-something man, in a tight suit with thin smile, welcomed him without much enthusiasm. "Welcome, Mr. Jake. Just some old reports. Look over the red marks if you want. But don't take it too seriously. We're not the FBI," he said, walking off, leaving behind a trail of sharp cologne. Jake sat on the squeaky leather chair. His desk was nearly empty, just an old monitor and a stack of yellowing files. He looked around. Most of the young employees were buried in their laptops and coffee, barely glancing at him. But Jake didn't mind. He opened the first file. Inside was a monthly salary report for several branch offices. Nothing looked strange at first glance. But something didn't sit right. Identical payroll amounts showing up each week, tied to names he didn't recognize. He tilted his head. Back in his reconnaissance days, Jake had been trained to notice patterns, because patterns often reveal hidden intentions. On his very first day, Jake decided not to flag the usual red marks as instructed. Instead, he created his own list titled, "Names That Never Show Up." Jake stayed late that night. While most employees had packed up by 6, the lights in his corner stayed on. He sat still, his eyes moving from the monitor to his notebook, occasionally jotting down details in sharp, organized lines. There was something about the numbers that kept echoing in his mind. The transactions were too clean, too perfect. Every Friday afternoon, a cluster of salary payments would be processed. Same amounts, same formatting, always routed through the same 2 branch offices, both located in small towns Jake had never heard of. He opened a public map and typed in the address of one of the branches. Nothing. The location existed, but no office was listed there. In fact, Google Street View showed an empty lot with a rusted fence and overgrown weeds. Jake frowned. He dug deeper, searching old directories and business listings. The branch was real, at least on paper. It had been listed in the company's registry for over 2 years. But everything else about it was a ghost. The second branch wasn't much better. It did exist, barely. A small space above a laundromat in a dying town 3 hours out. The company's intranet said it had 12 staff members, but the office's phone line never picked up. When Jake tried calling, he got a dull tone, then silence. He stood up and walked over to Doris, a senior auditor who'd been at Evergrove for more than a decade. Her cubicle was cluttered with coffee mugs and thick files. "Hey, Doris, I've got a weird question," Jake began. "Do you remember any audits involving the Hadley or White Fort branches?" She paused and slowly shook her head. "Those 2? I think they were handled directly by regional. We don't usually touch them." "Why?" Jake hesitated, but her eyes narrowed before he even answered. "You're digging into payroll?" He nodded slightly. Doris glanced around, lowered her voice, and said, "Look, I don't know what you saw, but some files you're better off ignoring, especially when it's that clean." Jake didn't respond. He just gave her a polite nod and walked back to his desk. Inside, something had shifted. A silent warning had just been delivered. But Jake had learned one thing from his years in uniform. The louder the silence, the deeper the truth. By midweek, Jake had already become the quiet presence people avoided. In meetings, he spoke little. In the cafeteria, he sat alone. Some staff smiled politely but quickly looked away. He wasn't offended. He'd seen this behavior before, in war zones, before a mission, when soldiers kept their distance from the one most likely not to return. Jake wasn't just reviewing files anymore. He was tracking movement, digital movement, logins, approvals, transaction timestamps. It wasn't long before he noticed something troubling. Many of the questionable salary entries were approved using the same internal ID, even though they were supposedly authorized by different managers. He approached the IT department and asked for limited access to deeper logs. Purely for clarification, he said. The young man at the desk, with headphones still hanging around his neck, froze for a second. I'd have to ask Lenny for that. Jake nodded slowly. Of course. Let me know what he says. The next morning, Jake's company laptop refused to boot. A plain black screen with a blinking underscore. He tried again. Nothing. He walked to the IT room. The same technician now avoided eye contact. Yeah, it's weird, he muttered. Looks like a boot error. Could take days. Jake knew better. That laptop had been tampered with. Later that afternoon, someone slid an envelope onto his desk. No name. Inside, a printed page with only 2 lines typed at the top. You're not the first one to ask questions. Just be smart and stop. Paul. Jake read it twice. The name Paul didn't ring a bell, but the paper smelled faintly of old cigarette smoke, like the kind you find in the break room near the service elevators. That evening, Jake waited. He didn't go home. Instead, he sat in the shadows of the hallway near the freight access, pretending to scroll his phone. Around 8:30, a night guard passed by. Middle-aged, slow walk, familiar tired eyes. Jake stood up. You're Paul. The man looked surprised but didn't deny it. He stepped closer. You're not the first, Paul whispered. But if you push this too far, they'll push back harder. Jake didn't ask who they were. He just said, Who else asked before me? Paul hesitated. Then he muttered, One guy from legal, a woman from compliance. Both gone within months. Fired, transferred, or just vanished quietly. No one talks about them anymore. Jake nodded slowly. He had confirmation now, not just suspicion. There was something hidden here, and it didn't want to be found. Jake arrived earlier than usual the next morning. The building was still dark, the cleaning crew just finishing up. He didn't turn on the lights in his cubicle. Instead, he opened his notebook under the faint glow of the city through the blinds. He began to cross-check. Each name from the payroll list was entered into the company's internal database, HR records, email registry, and ID card system. The result was always the same. Nothing. No active ID cards. No employee photos. No performance reviews. No digital footprints. These people didn't just go unnoticed. They didn't exist. Jake found 31 of them. He started compiling profiles. Fake profiles. He mapped every transaction connected to them. Most were linked to the same 2 ghost branches, Hadley and White Fork. Payment cycles were precise, never late, never questioned. And the money? Routed to bank accounts under initials, not full names. Then, withdrawn in cash from small ATMs in remote counties. He needed another set of eyes. Jake approached Doris again. This time, he showed her part of the data. She looked at the spreadsheet, blinking slowly. This is payroll fraud. I know, Jake replied quietly. Her voice lowered to a near whisper. Jake, if this is real, it's not just someone inside a branch messing around. This would have needed authorization from regional, maybe even above that. Jake nodded. That's what I'm afraid of. She looked up at him. Concern etched across her face. Do you have copies of this? Not here, Jake answered. Nothing stays on this system. Doris leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. Be careful. They don't like people getting close to this. I've seen it before. People start connecting dots, and suddenly their contract gets reviewed, or security finds something in their locker. One day you're in your chair, next day you're just gone. Jake stayed silent, but his mind was already working ahead. Ghost employees, real money, systematic laundering, and someone high up was keeping it all alive. By Friday, Jake had made his decision. He printed a copy of the payroll records, folded them carefully into a folder, and took the company car under pretense of a regional audit inspection. No one questioned him. Lenny was away at a leadership retreat, and most of the office had already shifted into weekend mode. Jake's first stop was Hadley. The town was barely on the map, an old railroad community with shuttered diners, empty storefronts, and no sign of life beyond a single gas station. He drove through the main street twice before finding the address listed on the company directory. It was a broken-down warehouse. Windows boarded. No signage. Overgrown weeds surrounded the front lot. A rusted chain hung from a lock gate. No company name. No mail slot. No trace of any office, let alone a financial branch. Jake stepped out and took photos. He circled the building. On the back wall, he found a faded logo, barely visible through peeling paint. Evergrove Finance. Regional office. But it looked like it hadn't been used in years. As Jake stood there in silence, an old man across the street walked out of a pawn shop. Jake approached him. "Excuse me," Jake said. "Was there ever an office here?" The man squinted. "Long time ago. Maybe 3-4 years?" They packed up fast. No one really knew what they did here. It was always empty inside. Jake thanked him and drove on to White Fork. 3 hours later, he reached a quiet strip mall beside a highway. Half its shops empty. The listed address for the branch turned out to be a second-floor suite, sandwiched between a closed dentist office and an abandoned yoga studio. The lights were off. A handwritten paper on the door read, "Temporarily closed for renovation." But through the glass, Jake could see dust-covered furniture, a disassembled printer, and stacks of unopened mail. He knocked anyway. No answer. Jake took more photos. His folder was growing thick. But as he walked back to his car, he noticed something that made his pulse tighten. Across the parking lot, in an unmarked sedan, someone was sitting in the driver's seat, watching him. The man wore sunglasses. Though the sun had already dipped behind the horizon, he didn't move. He didn't even pretend to be looking elsewhere. Jake got in his car slowly, drove out of the lot, checked the mirror. The sedan followed. He didn't drive home. Instead, he took a winding route back into Houston, passing through side streets and service roads, looping until he was sure, absolutely sure, he wasn't being followed. That night, Jake didn't sleep. His instincts were louder now. What he'd touched wasn't just internal fraud. It was protected. Monday morning, Jake arrived at the office before dawn. He took the service elevator to avoid the main lobby. His eyes were sharper now, more cautious. He no longer walked the halls like an employee, but like a soldier behind enemy lines. He made his way to the internal legal department, folder in hand, ready to report everything to compliance. But when he arrived, the lights were off. The door had a printed sign taped to it. Department temporarily closed. Please refer all inquiries to Human Resources. Jake stood there in silence. He walked back to his desk. His computer was gone. In its place sat a brand new monitor and keyboard. A yellow sticky note read, "Welcome upgrade. Enjoy IT." Jake opened the top drawer of his desk. Empty. No files. No copies. His printed documents were gone. He checked the supply closet, where he'd hidden a backup drive beneath a loose floorboard. It was missing. Someone had cleaned him out. Later that day, Doris passed by his cubicle without looking at him. But just as she walked away, she dropped a folded note into his lap. Jake waited until he was alone. Inside, written in shaky pen, "They know. They've been inside your machine. They erased everything. Don't trust HR. Don't talk to Lenny." Jake folded the note and burned it in a disposable coffee cup. He didn't panic. He didn't show fear. But deep inside, his military mind was shifting. This wasn't fraud anymore. It was conspiracy, and it had layers. Lenny had returned that afternoon. He approached Jake with a wide smile. "Hey there, partner. Heard you've been a little busy. Maybe slow it down, yeah? You're making some folks nervous." Jake didn't flinch. "Just doing my job." Lenny's smile held, but his eyes turned cold. "Then keep doing what you're told. That's all anyone here expects." As Lenny walked away, Jake opened a blank notepad on the desk and wrote one word in the center, Mason. It was a name he'd only seen once, on a digital authorization stamp for one of the Ghost Peril entries. Mason Krieg, Chief Financial Director. Jake had never met him. never seen him in any meetings. But that name kept appearing in the shadows of every suspicious transaction. And now, Jake had nothing left, no files, no laptop, no backups, except for one thing, his own mind. The office was noisier than usual. Phones rang, footsteps echoed, but Jake barely noticed. He sat still, hands folded, eyes closed, not sleeping, just remembering every number, every name, every date. He reconstructed the pattern entirely in his head. Years of field missions had trained him to memorize complex layouts under pressure. Now, that same skill became his weapon. He redrew the web of transactions in his notebook by hand. This time not to report, but to understand. Money was being funneled through fake salaries. From there, it traveled to shell accounts in rural towns. Then the funds were withdrawn in cash, over and over. But what happened after? Jake remembered a single line buried in a report about marketing expenses filed a week after each batch of withdrawals. The spending was vague: event support, vendor services, influencer fees, all approved by someone listed as MC and always electronically signed. Mason Krieg. Jake checked the internal employee directory again. No photo, no bio, only a title. Chief Financial Director. No scheduled meetings. No desk, only a private line that went straight to voicemail. He went deeper, into old press releases, board filings, archived documents. Mason Krieg hadn't been seen in public for over a year. It was as if the company had turned him into a ghost, too. Jake stared at the walls of the office. Sleek glass, smooth floors, clean suits, everyone moving like nothing was wrong. But now he could see it. The company wasn't just ignoring the fraud. It was built around it. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. He answered but said nothing. A mechanical voice, clearly run through a voice scrambler, spoke. You need to stop. Click. Jake slowly placed the phone down. Later that evening, as the sun faded, he stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere in those towers, someone had turned this company into a personal machine for laundering millions, right under everyone's nose. And now, they knew he was getting close. But Jake had something they didn't. He was never afraid of shadows. He learned to move through them. Night fell over Houston like a curtain of glass and steel. Jake didn't go home. He stayed behind after hours, alone in the building with only the distant hum of air vents and the occasional creak of settling beams. The main office lights were off, but the emergency strip along the hallway cast just enough glow for him to move unseen. He wasn't alone for long. Paul, the night security guard, appeared at the end of the corridor, nodding once. No words, just a silent agreement between two men who understood the risk. Jake followed him down to the basement level, where unused network terminals had been set up years ago and mostly forgotten. Here, beneath the company's polished floors, existed a system still connected to the old internal servers, isolated from the main cloud. Jake plugged in his personal laptop. Unlike the one issued by the company, this one had never been touched. He inserted a slim drive, his fingers moving fast but steady. With a manual script, he bypassed the internal firewalls and accessed archived payroll data, routing records, and digital authorization logs. The files were still there. Even after the deletions, the backups had missed a few nodes. He worked for over an hour in silence, name by name, transaction by transaction, connecting each payroll entry to a shell vendor, then to a marketing fund, then to one final account. It all ended in a corporate entity registered in Nevada under the name GR Holdings, a known front used in multiple money laundering investigations over the past decade. Jake encrypted everything and saved it to 3 separate drives. One he kept with him. One he would mail anonymously to a state investigator the next morning. And one would be delivered by hand to company's board. Before shutting everything down, he left a single file open on the screen, a full network diagram showing the fraudulent web of transactions, with Mason Krieg's name highlighted at the top in red. Paul stood by the door, watching the hallway. They're not going to take this quietly, he muttered. I don't need them to, Jake replied. I just need them to see what I see. He powered off the system, wiped it clean. As they ascended back to the lobby, Jake looked at the building around him, this polished tower of glass and deceit, and knew the time for hiding was over. It was time to walk through the front door, with evidence, and no way back. Monday morning arrived, sharp and cold. Jake didn't wear his usual office attire. He walked into the Evergrove headquarters wearing his military dress jacket. Creased but clean, decorated with service ribbons that hadn't seen light in years. He carried a manila envelope under his arm, and his eyes didn't blink as he passed through the lobby. Lenny saw him first, standing near the elevators. "Jake, what the hell is this?" Jake didn't stop. "Tell the board I need 10 minutes." In front of everyone. Lenny grabbed his arm. Jake turned, slowly, just enough to let Lenny see something in his eyes. Calm, steady defiance. The kind of look that doesn't argue. It just ends things. 10 minutes, Jake repeated, or I walk this envelope straight to the state attorney's office. Minutes later, the conference room on the 12th floor filled with faces. Executives, directors, legal advisors. A few whispered among themselves, unsure why this quiet old man had called a meeting with no notice. Mason Krieg was there, tall, sharply dressed, eyes hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses. He sat at the head of the table like a statue. Jake stood at the other end. He didn't use the projector. He didn't pass out slides. He opened the envelope, placed 3 USB drives on the table, and began speaking. "I've spent the last 7 days analyzing internal payroll data. 31 fake employees. 2 branches that don't exist. A network of ghost accounts used to move millions right through this company's systems." Murmurs erupted. Jake held up a single sheet. "This is a full map of those transactions, all leading to a shell company, GR Holdings, registered under an alias owned by your financial director, Mason Krieg." Gasps. Some stood. A few looked toward Mason. Jake didn't stop. This morning, 1 copy of this data was sent to the Office of State Financial Oversight. Another is in the hands of a federal compliance investigator. If I vanish, if this is ignored, it goes public. Automatically. Silence fell like a drop of lead. Mason leaned back, expression unreadable. "You're just a temporary hire," he said softly. Jake replied, "I've spent my life uncovering things men like you try to hide. In deserts, in jungles, in burned-out buildings. I know the look of rot, even when it wears a suit." For a long moment, no one moved. Then a voice from legal whispered into a phone. 2 security personnel appeared at the door, but not to escort Jake. They approached Mason Krieg. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Krieg stood without resistance, buttoning his coat as if leaving a lunch meeting. Jake stood still, unmoving, as the man walked past him. Their shoulders nearly brushed. Mason didn't speak, but Jake caught the faintest twitch in the man's jaw. The silence was over. The war this time had been won with truth instead of weapons. The headlines exploded within 24 hours. Senior executive at Evergrove Finance arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Veteran auditor uncovers decade-long internal laundering operation. From battlefield to boardroom, 1 man exposes corporate corruption. News vans lined up outside the building. Reporters swarmed the front steps. Cameras flashed as agents escorted Mason Krieg out in handcuffs, his polished shoes stepping over broken trust and shattered reputation. Jake Brennan wasn't there to see it. He had quietly handed in his resignation letter before sunrise. No farewell email. No speech. Just a typed note left on the desk. Mission complete. No further service required. He walked out the back exit of the building in silence, the same way he had walked into combat zones, calm, focused, already thinking 2 steps ahead. Some of the staff would never know what he did. Some would pretend they never saw anything. But a few, like Doris, stood in stunned silence that morning, reading the internal memo from the board of directors announcing a full investigation and a corporate restructuring. Whispers turned to apologies. Smirks turned into silence. And fear turned into respect. A month later, Jake was seen sitting at a coffee shop in a quiet part town. No suit, no uniform, just a book, a cup of strong black coffee, and a folded newspaper tucked beside him. The waitress, curious, finally asked, "So, did you really take down your entire company?" Jake smiled, just barely. "No," he said. "It took itself down. I just refused to look away." He didn't stay long. Paid in cash. Tipped well. And as he stepped outside into the fading afternoon sun, the wind caught the edge of his coat. In his inner pocket, a thumb drive rested quietly. One he hadn't turned in. One final copy. Just in case. Because Jake Brennan, soldier turned auditor, had learned one simple truth. Sometimes, the real war doesn't happen overseas. It happens at home.